Hey everyone, Aaron Philbeck here at Kai Association, and I am joined by Chris Heller, who is the co-founder and co-managing partner of Cordillera Investment Partners. Chris, thanks so much for joining me for the conversation today.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it. Great to be on.
Great. Well, as I told you before, I am a sports novice, both in terms of being a fan, but also learning about the investment opportunity set. So I'm excited to have a conversation with you and help me understand this quickly growing and evolving asset class. Maybe just to start, Chris, could you spend some time categorizing the investable sports universe, and what kind of insights can you provide in terms of broader market segmentation that's out there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Aaron. Broadly, you can think about sports and investing in the sports space similarly to a lot of different areas, a lot of different segments, industries, et cetera. So if you think about sports, you can have both credit and equity like. So on the credit side of investing, certainly there is lending against media rights, um, lending against stadiums and real estate and hard assets related to sports. Um, Even things like factoring and other ways to finance in the sports, like we've done factoring of transfer receivables in European football. So when one player is being traded from one team to another, and one team is supposed to get a payment over some period of time, another team might want to get a one lump sum payment, and we can help finance that. So there's sort of a whole credit ecosystem that exists in sports, and it's probably from an investability and investable standpoint, been around longer than the equity side for institutional investors, because sports has always been lumped with media, and a lot of the ways that people, and when we first started investing in sports, it really came at it from a media lens. And there are long-term contracted um, payments and revenues to sports franchises that come from AAA credit media players in the space that have always been sort of, assets that you could lend against. So that's one side of the equation is the credit side. The other side is more equity, which I think has evolved over time. It obviously in the sport it usually started with high net worth individuals owning properties and, tens of millionaires that were hundreds of millionaires and now billionaires, owning teams, et cetera. But certainly recently, I'll call it the last 5 years, maybe 5 to 10 years, has been opened up to the institutional investing space. Well, some of it has to do with leagues making changes to the types of people or types of entities that they will allow to invest. And some of it is institutional investors understanding that there are interesting properties to this space. There's a little bit of, change from league and sports and governance perspective, and then change from, I think a perception from institutional investors. And then when you think about the equity space, it really subdivides into a couple of different ways. There's investors investing in the big leagues. So NFL, NBA, NHL, English Premier League, La Liga. And, those are properties that tend to have media rights in place, lucrative media rights deals. So as an investor, you can come in and underwrite those media rights. They're usually against very credit-worthy counterparties. And so you think about those investments as a little bit more, I think of them as like infrastructure like returns because they're knowable, credit-worthy revenue streams that you can underwrite over time. So that risk reward is an interesting one, but more infrastructure like returns because what you're going to get from a revenue perspective. And then where we tend to focus is a little bit more on the sort of nichier parts of sports that are, against all kinds of other properties. And I'm sure we'll talk about this in podcasts, but, newer leagues, women, all kinds of other things that you can think about that there's not a ton of capital being focused on, but where you can find interesting opportunities. So you got kind of credit, equity, and then within that subdivided.
Yeah, Chris, there's a couple of threads that I want to make sure we pick up on, but maybe given you kind of walk through these different categories, and you alluded to this a little bit, but talk through kind of the due diligence process of actually underwriting some of these sports assets, and how does that differ across some of those different segmentations, and maybe in particular for maybe some of those newer leagues that you alluded to, there may not be a long operating history. So how do you even go about kind of the underwriting process of selecting some of these assets that you think are good long-term investments?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, look, one of the things that we really, so the idea that some of these don't have a long history of either investors investing in them or operations is slightly different. And I would say that we like the idea, and we are always, as a firm, Cordillera focuses on, we don't only specialize in sports. So we focus on niche, non-correlated, off the beaten path assets. So our DNA is in trying to find things that the rest of the world isn't looking at. And we like that. And so in sports, there are certain properties like, again, like the big leagues in the NFL, where it's pretty well trodden as to how you value these assets, et cetera. But once you start getting into sort of more what we call the nooks and crannies of sports, the parts that the rest of the world isn't looking at, one of the advantages that we find is that there is no really set valuation technique. And we like places like that because that is both obviously a risk for those that don't spend a lot of time in it, but it's also the opportunity that you can pick off things that, you know, in a very super efficient asset class, everybody knows exactly how to value something to the penny. This is not one of those. And we think that offers the opportunity. But so, the way that we tend to think about underwriting sports assets is in a few ways. First is related to media rights. Like when you're looking at sports, things sort of begin and end with media rights. And so that means a few things. Either you have media rights and it can be underwritable. And that's one set of investments. And I talked about that a little bit, sort of like more infrastructure like. And then there's this whole series of things within sports that just don't have media rights yet. And in that world, there's a couple of different types of investments. One is, and we get shown this most often, and we say no to this nearly all the time, which is this idea that, hey, look, I have this new idea, whether it's a new league, track and field, snowboarding, ping pong, whatever it might be, badminton. We've been shown like everything. That I've got this new league, super interesting. We don't have media rights yet, but if you invest in, we'll use your capital to sort of get this league up and running into a place where we're going to get this great media rights deal. That is fine and good, but it is just venture-like investing. It is very hard. It is a highly competitive space. And this idea that, oh yeah, if I create this league, I'm going to get all these media rights, pretty binary and we're pretty skeptical of that. So that version, and there's a lot of it in sports, is something that we don't love. There is then the third version of this, which is new formats, new leagues, et cetera, where media rights, you don't need that in order to prove out the returns. That might be upside and it might be a lottery ticket, but there are revenue streams attached to that asset that are not media rights, whether it's, we have an investment in the Pro Triathlon Organization. And so whether it's sponsorships or mass participation or what we call hosting fees, we can underwrite revenues in a way and costs that are not purely a bet on media rights. So that's sort of from an economic perspective, how we think about it. And then I think there are some really interesting nuances to how do we assess sports properties when we're looking at the nooks and crannies of sports properties that are very particular to sports that don't exist really in other places. And that's, we look at a sports property, there's a kind of a framework that we use, which is quality, jeopardy, and connection. And so when we're looking at a property, first is quality. Are the best players, athletes in the world participating in this thing that we are looking at? So, we look at European football clubs, and like that tends to get like the highest quality. The Pro Triathlon Organization that we've invested in, the best triathletes in the world compete in this, and you want that quality. And so you can look at tennis tournaments. You can invest in tennis tournaments in various USTA tournaments. Some the best players in the world are going to play at it, and some of them are second, third tier tournaments where you're not going to get the best players in the world. There's also new formats and leagues that are super interesting from a concept perspective. You think about European football, Ballers League, Kings League. You might come across this in some of your research. They're new formats for soccer. They're shorter. They're more gamified. So they attract, they appeal. And this is what's great about them. They appeal to, my kids' generation. My kids don't consume sports in the same way that I consume sports growing up. They cannot sit through a full football game or soccer game, et cetera. And there's a lot of leagues that are trying to cater to that. But like Ballers League and Kings League, they don't have, the top quality talent participating in those leagues. They have other things going for them, but not that quality. So one is quality. So we're always looking at, you have the best athletes in the world. The second is Jeopardy. And this one's really important, which is coming into a competition or a season, do you know who's going to win? Like, is there, and the NFL does the best job in the world at this, at parity. You never know going into any season who's going to win. There are some dynasties and some legacies, but for the most part, they do a great job at Jeopardy. It's really exciting every season. This is what's interesting about golf tournaments and tennis tournaments, single knockout, really exciting. You don't know who's going to win. As opposed to, let's have a French football where PSG wins every year, or in the Spanish league, Barcelona, Real Madrid. So they don't have high scores on Jeopardy. So we like quality Jeopardy. And the last is connection, which is how do fans connect, or, consumers of the product connect? Is there a social media aspect? Is there a media aspect? Like, how do you really get people to want to connect with this product? And we think about like things like the Pro Triathlon Organization that we love, that we've invested in. It's got all of that, right? It's got the highest quality athletes participating. It's got Jeopardy. You never know who's going to win any given race. And then, which means that over the course of the season, who's going to win essentially the entire season. And then connection. You can really, through social media and all kinds of ways, you can identify with these athletes, get connected through and so we love that piece of it. So that's kind of very idiosyncratic to sports and how we think about sports. But then again, on the really media rights is how you really have to sort of underwrite the economics of this business.
So, Chris, maybe a follow up on this is, you mentioned this, the digital experience and the gamification on some of the smaller leagues, but it seems like the desire for more in person engagement and community is grown quite a bit post COVID, in particular. But how do you kind of think about the return of live experience versus some of those more digital gamified social media experiences? And do you kind of prefer one versus the other, or is it more about kind of segmenting the type of league and the delivery mechanism that it offers?
It really, one, it's true. So it's true. We like post COVID, we have seen this idea of, and we look at things in music and live music venues as well. We have certainly seen this idea that the desire to sort of consume live entertainment is there. And so it's through the roof. Now, the question is, what are you paying for that? Meaning this comes down to a valuation question as well, because everybody knows that that's there. And so there's a little bit of a valuation question about how much are you willing to pay for it, but it's absolutely true. And we love that and we like that. But it definitely depends on the sports property that you're looking at, because some properties like the NFL, it doesn't matter if anybody ever shows up to watch a game in person because all the revenues are based on media rights for the most part. Mm-hmm. Other properties are completely dependent on what we call butts in seats, people actually being there. And so while it is true that we know this is a tailwind, you kind of have to think about what specifically are you thinking about investing in? Does it matter or not that people are in their seats? And then secondly, if it does matter that people are in the seats, has it been priced in already, or from a valuation perspective, are you getting, something that's interesting? But we do like this idea of this tailwinds to sports, particularly women's sport. We do a lot, and women's sports is a piece of what we look at. When we are thinking about that, it is important. Their media rights is there, but it's not as big a deal as a percentage of the revenue pie as it is in the NFL. And so it does matter to us, who comes and how many people come, because it's a big piece of the revenue pie. Oh, and we like it. It's actually a tailwind, we think, to one of our investments in women's sports, and particularly it gets into the sort of micro of like, what franchise are you investing in? What city are you investing in? What is the support from the mayor or the city council around the team, et cetera? What is the fan experience like? Do they have a purpose built stadium or not? Are they playing in, a stadium that was built for, a men's like American football team, and we're going to put a women's soccer team in it. Like, so all of that stuff matters. So if you are dependent on getting in-person consumption of your product, make it good. Like, make sure there are some tailwinds behind it.
So I want to talk about women's sports because you mentioned it a few times, and this kind of being the maybe the emerging leagues that you guys are so interested in. There's obviously some structural differences between men's sports and women's sports, and some disadvantages on the women's side. So how do you kind of, I guess, what is the role that you play when you come into an emerging league like women's soccer, for example, and the value creation levers that you can pull to try to grow that beyond media rights, which I know you said is an important piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we view women's the capital that a firm like ours can provide in the women's sports, that it can be transformational. That it is, unfortunately, in some areas can be 20 years behind where the men's game is. And, a lot of the women's, and let's just take women's football because it's an investment that we have been tethered to men's programs, and particularly in Europe, have been, you know, tethered to men's teams. They've been an afterthought. They've been essentially subsidized by the men's teams, but not run as a product in and of themselves. And in order for that to have happened, somebody would have to come in with outside capital and want to make an investment specifically in that property to then transform it into something that can exist on its own. And we think there are some really interesting opportunities there. And, I talked about this a little bit already, but particularly like physical infrastructure. So you think about like a stadium, and this is true both in the US and in Europe, where is the team playing in something that provides the best fan experience for that property? And oftentimes the answer is no. Like, they'll be playing in either and this can happen in Europe, where you're playing in like almost like a playground, like, just a normal field with maybe a couple of bleachers in there at best. In the US, it might be the opposite, where they're playing in, a 70,000 person stadium, which is not ideal for the product either. And so, do they have, a purpose built stadium for that experience? I think is really interesting. Um, training for women, and like, what does the training center look like? What do training programs and trainers look like? I was with an executive of a women's soccer NWSL team a couple months ago, and he was lamenting the fact that, I think they had 5 or 6 ACL injuries on the team at that time. And there's been a lot of research that women tear their ACLs more often than men, and why. And so, we need to do a lot of work around why is that happening? What training programs can we do different? What can we do differently for women than we do for men? Um, so I think there's just a lot of things that can go into capital, and sort of physical infrastructure, um, for women. And, a lot of that comes down to, if you're gonna be, you know, we we have invested in the Denver NWSL expansion team, and we're super happy. The city council just approved the building of the stadium. And you kind of have to go into if that is important, and the idea that like attendance is important to the overall, for us, you know, returns of the investment, then you want to be in spaces where there are tailwinds and highly supportive, regulators involved to sort of to make that happen. And that's really, important to us. And then there's obviously then the sort of private equity like value add plays that can happen in women's that you just haven't really been focused on from historically, that I think is an interesting opportunity. Um, I will say, I think when we talk about about women's sports in general, and I think you mentioned this, Aaron, it you do have to go in with your eyes wide open and be careful, because I think look, we're not the only ones to realize that women's sports are taking off, and that it is in a place that is probably 15 years behind where the men's game was. And I call this the Caitlin Clark effect, but like certainly, the WNBA has taken off. And I think one of the things you have to be careful about right now in investing in women's sports is, and this comes back to valuation, you know, is the Caitlin, like everything that we now see, like have certain things been overpriced for what they might be? That like, hey, look, I've got this really interesting women's property, and so pay me X amount X amount revenue, whatever it might be for that, because look at all these tailwinds to women's sports, which are true in certain places, but there's a lot of risk in other places, certainly from a valuation perspective, or this, like I talked about, and when we think about connection, is there going to be a connection to all of this stuff? I mean, it is a crowded sports landscape, and where are you going to spend your money? And so for us, the NWSL in the US was a really interesting place for us, because it was sort of sat in this like Goldilocks where it's not the WNBA, which has really taken off. It's also not some brand new property that no one has ever heard of. The NWSL, along with the WSL in Europe, are kind of the preeminent leagues in the world. So they've kind of gotten out of that venture-like place, but they're not all the way to where the WNBA was. And so it was in this really nice place of, we found it interesting from an economic perspective. It wasn't venture and brand new, but it also wasn't all the way down the line. And so it kind of ended up in this really nice place that had been de-risked, but we thought we could get, a really interesting opportunity in it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. So, you talk about women's sports being 10 to 15 years behind men's sports. So, and I realize this is a broad statement, but is the thesis that these sports leagues will eventually catch up to where the men's leagues are, or is it more of like a different path that you see for these leagues, whether it's demographics that are coming in to watch these different sports or the economics of it? Like, how do you kind of, I guess, how do you compare women's sports to men's sports in terms of convergence versus a complete divergence in a different way?
Yeah. Really good question. And I want to be clear that when I say they're 10 to 15 years behind the men's game, not in the quality of the sport, obviously
Sure.
just in the
Yeah.
ecosystem around it. Um, yeah, look, I think it would be foolish to anybody who's underwriting whatever women's sport it is to be like, oh, we're going to take it from where it is to it's going to be the same as the men's game. And that may happen, but I think we look at it as its own path, right? Whatever. And it depends on what property you're looking at, but we underwrite its own path. We come in thinking there are tailwinds, which might mean that the growth, the actual CAGRs, the numbers are higher than in the men's game in terms of how it will grow, but it's starting from a completely and totally different base. And so you're not going to say, I don't think there's a place where you're going to say, okay, I'm starting here and I'm going to get to where, you know, the EPL is for a women, and so you really have to, this is where kind of the art meets the science, which is, this is what we do every day is underwrite. You have to create your own path. You do have to look at comps around like what has happened in the past to other franchises or and what path might we take, and then just sort of probability rank those distributions and be comfortable in, probably pricing it to, one standard deviation less than you think is your median. And if you can't get that pricing there, then you walk away. But you do have to underwrite its own path. Like I would say we at Cordillera are not saying, hey, let's take this women's and we're going to underwrite that it's going to be a mess. Now, there certainly are places where they can be equal. Like triathlon, one of the things we really liked about the Pro Triathlon Organization, it is the top 20 men, the top 20 women, they are paid exactly the same. And the viewership for the men and the women are exactly the same. So there are certainly places where that can be like women's tennis. Obviously, we've seen at times with Serena that it can be more popular than the men's game. So it sort of depends on what you're looking at. But I think if you're the idea for or at least for us, is not that like, oh, hey, let's women's, the infrastructure and investment around women's sports is 10 to 15 years behind. Do it now, and it's going to get to the same place the men's place is. You kind of have to underwrite your own path.
Got it. Chris, maybe a final question for you is on the exit environment, the secondary market for sports investing. So let's say you've invested for multiple years, you had this opportunity, the thesis is played out. I mean, is there a robust secondary market? How do you kind of create liquidity events for your investments when you've realized their potential?
Yeah. So it's evolved. I think if you rewound 25 years ago, you had to there had to be enough billionaires or hundreds of millionaires to buy the property. Now we were buying smaller properties that are not the case, but it used to be really kind of a high net worth game, and it still is. There's still participation from that in the space. I would say I think what has really evolved is private equity and private capital in the space. I mean, that is, you know, firms like ours and others around this that have, one, again, from a regulatory perspective, a lot of leagues have opened it up to that type of capital. And from other, the major leagues, NFL, NBA, NHL, English Premier League, et cetera, have realized the value of private capital for these other kind of nooks and crannies. And so we also look at infrastructure around sports. So we've made investments in not places where we don't have to make a bet on what team are we going to invest in, what league are we going to invest in, et cetera. So we're thinking about like the toll taker. If we believe that more capital is coming into sports, and so how do we invest in companies that are the toll takers around that? So you can think about brokers. It's a highly brokered space, these deals for sports. Consultancy, like there's lots of sports consultants around the spaces, law firms, kind of interesting places around like things that are just going to benefit that are focused on sports. That's just more and those exits are different, right? Those are kind of professional services companies. You could exit to anybody, even people who aren't really focused on sports. But private capital and private equity in sports franchises. And then, large media companies, right? Like there's an entire ecosystem in and around, even about Warner Brothers Discovery, Disney, Peacock, like you realize, and we've seen it in the number, still the one thing that is appointment viewing for any of these media companies is live sports. And so there are properties and other things you can own that would be natural exits to media companies. So you kind of got, high net worths, you've got private capital and private equity that is growing significantly with a much friendlier regulatory and ecosystem around it. And then you've got media companies in and around the space, which, for us leads to plenty of buyers potentially for what we're buying. But it is something that when you're going in to underwrite a deal, you have to understand, ex ante, who is the natural buyer for this, and not kind of go and just buy it and then hope that there's a buyer comes for it. We're always, when we're writing our memos around our deals, laying out what our base case buyer is. And it kind of depends for each type of deal that we do.
Great. Well, Chris, I think we're gonna have to leave it there, but this has been education for me, and I appreciate your time walking through some of these differences across the sports investment universe. So thanks so much.
Of course, Aaron. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.